in a Peru bloodied by terrorism and decimated by the economic crisis. An unknown engineer named Alberto Fujimori burst onto the electoral scene, capturing the hopes of millions of Peruvians tormented by violence and disillusioned by traditional parties. Starting from a tiny organization with little support and no previous experience in politics, Fujimori managed to carve out a space among the main political parties and snatch it from them. A key victory that seemed assured by the overwhelming popularity of the intellectual-turned-politician Mario Vargas Llosa. From his victory, Peru would embark on a profound transformation that would define the historical development of Peruvian society. In this new special installment, we will narrate the meteoric rise to the final frame of Alberto Fujimori, a man who in 10 years forever changed the history of his country and set the precedent for the current Peru with his economic and political reforms. My name is Alejandro Andrade. This is the New Encyclopedia, and we invite you to join us on this journey through the tumultuous Peru of the 90s. Alberto Fujimori's family roots trace back to Japan. His two parents, natives of Japan, emigrated to Peru in 1934 to work as agricultural workers. 4 years later, Alberto Fujimori was born into the immigrant family located in Lima. His early years were marked by the climate of anti-Japanese hostility encouraged by the Peruvian state. As for his academic life, although distant with his classmates, he was an exemplary student and always ranked among the top of his class. After high school, Fujimori studied agronomy at the National Agrarian University, and he continued to stand out as a brilliant student, graduating at the top of his class. His excellent academic record secured him scholarships to study pure physics and mathematics in France and the U.S. After finishing his studies, he would return to his alma mater to teach as a professor, gradually rising until he was appointed as a university rector in 1984. During this gradual climb of power in the university sphere, where he continued to remain anonymous, Fujimori's interest in politics was born. His main capital as a politician was his own cunning. Accustomed to carefully observing circumstances, he designed a strategy for rising to power, characterized by his high expectations, which he justified with his professional credentials. Apart from his experience as a teacher, Fujimori had diversified his portfolio by venturing into the real estate sector as a businessman, and he had approached the political circles of the country, hosting a current affairs program called Concertando, which aired between 1987 and 1989. While Fujimori was slowly advancing in his plans, Peru was sinking deeper and deeper into a serious crisis that claimed the lives of many innocents every day. For years, various armed groups with communist ideology had emerged in the interior of the country. Shining Path, the most remembered terrorist organization of all for its brutal crimes, was wreaking havoc in rural fields and major cities in an open war against the state. Along with the Tupac Amaru revolutionary movement, they managed to control extensive areas of Peru and Saufir among the most remote localities. Massacres, shootings, attacks, and car bombs destroying families and public buildings were the news that was heard internationally from the Andean country. The response of the governments to this and other political problems were insufficient in the face of escalating violence and deepening economic crisis, degeneration that contributed to the expansion of terrorism. In 1985, with very high expectations, Alan Garcia, a young politician, endowed with great oratory power and a faithful disciple to the founding ideology of the Peruvian Prista Party, was elected president by a wide margin. Faced with the inevitable economic debacle, the president pushed for a large-scale public reform, which, however, ended in a failed attempt to nationalize the banking sector and an exponential increase in corruption in public institutions. This resulted in rampant hyperinflation and a shortage of basic necessities. These economic measures by Alan Garcia sparked vigorous opposition among the population and his main political rivals. The person who capitalized on this popular discontent against the president was Mario Vargas Llosa, a famous novelist who entered political life advocating a shift towards economic liberalism. However, he used the platform offered to him by the system's parties, which came together in a single coalition called Fredemo, to support his presidential candidacy for the general elections of 1990. Seeing the perfect opportunity to present himself as an attractive alternative to traditional parties, Alberto Fujimori made his definitive leap onto the public stage. First, he aimed for the Senate of the Republic, which he tried to access through the parliamentary list of the Socialist Left Party. But after failing in his attempt, he organized his own political party, christened with the name of Cambio 90. In the early days of his organization, this was an extremely poor party and did not seem to have any chance of aspiring to a first place in the elections. Grouped under the leadership of a man almost unknown as Fujimori, within its ranks converged people with no previous experience in politics, citizens disappointed with the parties, and some small business owners. However, the group that stood out most among its members were the members of evangelical churches, who, using their missionary proselytizing techniques, house by house, they would play a leading role in the expansion of Fujimori's popularity in the most popular areas. In contrast, there was a beloved novelist who seemed to have everything in his favor to win without any problems. Vargas Llosa offered an image of unity and had a liberal economic program drafted by a qualified team of technicians. His main proposal was an economic shock that would entail many social costs, but would allow Peru to reintegrate into the international economy over time and remedy hyperinflation and shortages. Behind his campaign was the constant advice of a prestigious international political marketing company with countless amounts of money for advertising. Crucially, he had backing from numerous influential sectors. But the public, upon hearing the details of his program as the campaign progressed, began to perceive the economic shock as a decision that was too extreme. This earned him a public image as a politician out of touch with reality and allied with the system. With the fall in popularity of Vargas Llosa, voter sympathies shifted towards Alberto Fujimori, who had chosen a strategy radically opposed to that of his adversary. Fujimori conducted a personalistic campaign that avoided party obligations. He focused on appealing to the lower classes and independent voters, and placed special emphasis on political agreement, more than an economic shock, as the solution to the Peruvian crisis. After obtaining a close second place with Mario Vargas Llosa in the first round of the election, Fujimori would win in the second round with more than 60% of the votes. With the resounding rejection of the Congress of the Republic and a disastrous economic legacy, Alan Garcia bid farewell to the head of state in July of 1990 to hand over the presidential sash to Alberto Fujimori in a political climate of uncertainty. Immediately facing the problems that plagued the country, within a few weeks, Fujimori set out to undertake a stabilization program that was called Fuji Shock by the public, radically changing his position, gradual and moderate. Fujimori's government liberalized subsidized prices and cut social spending in the same way it increased interest rates and taxes. In this way, the government was confident in defeating hyperinflation and stabilizing the economy. The implementation of this program was announced by the Minister of Economy. In a historic message to the nation, which ended with the hopeful phrase, "May God help us." The shock that Fujimori had promised not to apply had become a reality. The effects of these policies on the economy were soon felt. The price of gasoline increased 3,000% overnight, while the price of most food increased by about 500%. The prices of basic services also experienced an exponential increase. The water rate grew to unimaginable prices and the electricity rate quintupled. Despite not solving but exacerbating short-term economic problems, Alberto Fujimori continued to have broad support among the population, but the improvements would still take time to arrive. This drastic economic shock was followed in 1991 by a series of measures aimed at restructuring Peru's impoverished and isolated economic system. These measures included the start of privatizations of state-owned companies, deregulation of the labor market, tax and tariff reforms, incentives for private investment, and the decentralization of some social services. Thus, the government hoped to regain the confidence of international banking and reintegrate Peru into the global economy. To alleviate the situation of the sectors most impoverished by monetary policies, the Fujimori government established a National Compensation and Social Development Fund, whose purpose was to help the poor through small investment projects. Likewise, the government created a national food assistance program to contribute to the supply of food to the poorest areas. However, the economy and poverty were not the only concerns of the Peruvian government. Both Shining Path and the Tupac Amaru revolutionary movement continued to bloody the country and threaten the promises of a better future. To combat this dangerous enemy, Fujimori had formed a strategic alliance with the armed forces, which over time would become the support of his political designs. This fruitful coexistence with the army allowed him to authorize the creation of civil defense patrols in cities and rural fields to whom he supplied weapons, under the approval of Congress. Thus, an alliance was cemented, until now unthinkable, between the army and the peasantry in the fight against terrorism. On the other hand, to support the army in the fight against subversion, Fujimori created a military court to try suspects of terrorism, and he decreed that members of the armed forces could not be tried in civil courts for human rights violations. These decisions, although harshly criticized at the time, responded to a critical situation. The presence of Sendero Luminoso, whose core was in the interior of the country, began to expand towards Lima, leading the urban population into the whirlwind of violence. Every week there were reports of the murder of public officials, Catholic priests, community leaders, and innocent civilians. And Sendero celebrated having achieved strategic parity with the Peruvian state. But it comes under these circumstances to 1992, a year that would go down in history as the beginning of a new political era. By the beginning of 1992, tensions between Congress and Fujimori's government were at their highest point. Fujimori accused the legislative power of obstructing his economic program and the judicial power of hindering the fight against terrorism. Faced with constant disagreement among the three powers and unanimous resistance from the opposition, Alberto Fujimori decided to dissolve the Congress of the Republic and reorganize the judicial power. While his historic message to the nation was being broadcast on television, the main streets of Lima and institutional buildings were taken over by the military, and at the same time arrests were being made of the government's political opponents. With the support of the armed forces and also the population, Fujimori announced the establishment of an emergency government and national reconstruction, which, in his own words, opened the country to a genuine democracy. Political parties immediately denounced that the president was executing a coup d'etat that returned the country to the darkness of dictatorship. However, Fujimori's decision was received by the public with great enthusiasm, a popular outcry that evidenced the discredit into which traditional politics had fallen. The public opinion was dominated by the idea that Peru needed a stronger government to get out of the crisis. More than 70% approved the closure of Congress, and nearly 90% supported the restructuring of the judiciary. Despite the broad support he received in Peru internationally, many countries protested Fujimori's decision. The Venezuelan government broke diplomatic relations with Fujimori's government, and the United States announced the suspension of economic assistance. This put Peru's reintegration into the international market at risk. This international pressure forced the government to call for elections that same year and convene a constituent assembly. The main political parties in protest against the self-coup abstained from participating. Meanwhile, Fujimori's party took advantage of the absence of its adversaries and popular support to achieve a parliamentary majority. Having achieved electoral success, the congressman drafted and sanctioned a new constitution, which is the same Magna Carta that remains in force to this day in Peru. The rest of Alberto Fujimori's first presidency was defined by the consolidation of the new economic model and victory over terrorism. In September of 1992, the Special Intelligence Group of Peru, known as the Grupo Especial de Inteligencia, undertook an operation to capture the leader of the Shining Path, Abamil Guzman. The operation was carried out in a house located in Lima, which had been rented by the head of the terrorist organization. The capture of the century, as it was named by the public, was the result of a long and meticulous police investigation whose success dealt a fatal blow to terrorism in Peru. And although terrorist elements continued to operate around the country, this episode marked the beginning of pacification. This era is also remembered for several massacres perpetrated by state agencies against innocent civilians. Among these bloody episodes, the Barrios Altos massacre and the execution of 9 students and a professor from Cantuta University stand out. One of the many crimes attributed to Alberto Fujimori and for which he is currently serving a prison sentence. Despite the bloody actions of the security forces and the corruption allegations against him, in the few years of his presidency, Fujimori had become a true political phenomenon in Peru's recent history. His decisions not only had the support of the armed forces, he was also supported by a large sector of the population that continued to place their trust in the government's program. Under these favorable circumstances, Fujimori began his campaign to be re-elected as president in the 1995 elections. Having already established himself as an antagonistic figure of the traditional parties, Fujimori continued with his disruptive discourse, appealing to the lower classes. In favor of his re-election, he presented to the public the achievements of his first term, such as the pacification of the country and the economic reintegration into international markets. And he assured that this was just the foundation of Peru, which he wished to build. A Peru with more employment and less poverty. With no competitor with real chances of surpassing his campaign, Fujimori achieved an overwhelming victory in the first round with 64% of the votes. Again, he achieved a majority in Congress and an open field without obstacles to continue with his government. While the decimated traditional parties still lacked the strength to pose a threat to his hegemony. But behind his political successes was a lawyer as unscrupulous as he was intelligent, a man who played a leading role in the consolidation and preservation of Alberto Fujimori's power. We're talking about Vladimiro Montesinos, the power behind the power. Fujimori and Montesinos had met during the development of the presidential campaign of 1990. Over the years, Montesinos became an increasingly present collaborator in Fujimori's political life. Montesinos served as the de facto chief of the National Intelligence Service and to contribute to the maintenance of Fujimorian power. He had a wide network of contacts, connections inside and outside of Peru, and knowledge of corruption codes. Through Montesinos, who became his right hand for the dirty work, Fujimori took care of paving the way in his favor. Controlling media, disappearing internal opponents, and buying influences, but also fighting the remaining elements of terrorism with a hard hand. One of the first actions Alberto Fujimori took after his re-election was the enactment of an amnesty law to pardon human rights crimes committed by state agents in the fight against terrorism. In economic matters, privatizations continued to be a central element in Fujimori's government. In 1996, a new private investment promotion law was enacted, and a commission for the promotion of private concessions was created. In this context, airports, ports, road networks, and mobile phone bans were transferred to private capital through concessions. And in 1998, the process of concessions in transport infrastructure works began. However, it should be noted that in certain cases, privatizations were characterized by irregularities and, more generally, by strong corruption in the use of resources from the sale of companies. And in the service area, which also went through privatizations, price and rate increases were recorded. On the other hand, when Peruvians began to enjoy greater tranquility in the cities, terrorism broke out again to shake society. In December of 1996, during the celebration of a ceremony at the residence of the Japanese ambassador in Lima, 14 terrorists from the criminal group Tupac Amaru Revolutionary Movement forcibly entered the property and took all the attendees hostage. In exchange for the lives of the innocent hostages, the terrorists demanded the release of 400 Tupac Amaru Revolutionary Movement members detained for terrorism, failing to reach an agreement with the state. The takeover of the residence lasted until April of 1997, months in which the government and the population lived in constant expectation and anxiety. To resolve the situation, one of the cleanest and most successful military rescue operations in history was conceived within the armed forces, known as Operation Chavin de Huántar. The National Intelligence Service developed the intelligence for the operation. The tasks in this specialty were under the leadership of Vladimiro Montesinos, who assumed the role of leader, delegating information exploration responsibilities, the construction of the replica of the residence for training, and the taking of photographs and filming of the rescue. But the most important element of the operation was the construction of the entrance tunnels to the residence and the infiltration of cameras and microphones through the hostages. On April 22, 1997, the rescue operation was successfully executed. After months of preparation, everything was ready and meticulously controlled for a satisfactory result. At 3:23 in the afternoon, a strong explosion on the floor of the main hall initiated the operation. After a few minutes, all the terrorists had been killed and all the hostages were rescued, except for one who died from a hemorrhage. And apart from internal pacification, Peru had to negotiate with Ecuador to delimit the borders of both countries. After an armed conflict remembered as the Cenepa War, fought in 1995 during the election campaign, by the end of the 1990s, a certain weakening began to be noticed in the ranks of Fujimorism, a product of internal divisions and corruption allegations. The crisis of Alberto Fujimori's ministerial cabinet in 1999. This situation had been revealed to the public opinion and projected an image of the government less vigorous than in previous years. However, seeking a second re-election, Fujimori ran again as a presidential candidate and launched his campaign to the rhythm of El Chino, a techno-cumbia song that quickly became popular for its catchy melody and lyrics. In the first round of the election, Fujimori obtained almost 50% of the votes, but the result was immediately denounced as fraudulent. His political adversaries began to spread the idea in society that the government was sabotaging the results to consolidate another term in power. Although in the end, Fujimori remained in power. This episode, filled with accusations and the notable decline in Fujimori's popularity, marked the beginning of the end of the president's public life. His third presidential term lasted just 4 months. In this short period of time, one of the biggest media scandals witnessed in Peru was uncovered. At a press conference, congressmen from the Independent Moralizing Front revealed a video to the public where Vladimiro Montesinos was seen bribing an opposition congressman with numerous bundles of bills, to add him to Fujimori's party bench. The dissemination of this video, which was the first of many, ignited a flame that spread throughout the government. Within days, Montesinos fled Peru to an unknown location. In 2001, journalistic investigations in Venezuela found clues to his whereabouts, and he was extradited to Peru. Vladimir Montesinos was sentenced to several years in prison for corruption of officials, forced disappearance, qualified homicide, money laundering, arms trafficking, among other crimes that have been attributed to him. Alberto Fujimori suffered a similar fate. His government did not survive public scorn and social protests. In the midst of a diplomatic tour of the Asian continent, the president abandoned his post, sending a fax from Tokyo notifying his resignation to Congress. Facing this unprecedented event, Congress rejected his resignation and removed him from office for moral incapacity. Alberto Fujimori was able to live in exile for several years, but he was eventually extradited from Chile to Peru in 2005 to stand trial. Currently, at 84 years old, he is still serving his sentence in prison for usurpation of functions, crimes against human rights, and corruption. This was the story of the rise of an unknown engineer to the presidency of Peru and the steps that led him to a bitter end. It was a period in the history of Peru marked by economic regeneration and the pacification of terrorism. But it is also remembered for its scandals and the positive and negative repercussions that Alberto Fujimori's legacy still has today. Thanks for watching the video until the end. Remember to subscribe so you don't miss new episodes, and we invite you to share this documentary with your acquaintances. Until next time.